Just because you're married doesn't mean you need to be on the same Medicare plan as your spouse. In fact, being on the same plan might actually cost you more or even limit your coverage. In this video, we're going to look at the 2 reasons why being on the same plan may not be your best move. So in the past, you might be used to having a family plan through your employer or your spouse's employer, where everyone's covered under that umbrella family policy. But Medicare doesn't really work that way. Everyone enrolls as an individual, and then you choose as an individual which route you want to take to fill the gaps of Medicare. So maybe you're going to do original Medicare and add a supplemental plan, like a G plan or an N plan, or maybe you want to go the Advantage route, where you choose to do a Medicare Advantage plan, also known as Part C, that somewhat replaces original Medicare. So it's kind of each man for their own when it comes to Medicare, very unlike those group or family plans that you've done in the past. Now, in this video, I want to look at the 2 reasons why it may not be advantageous to stay on the same plan. So the first one is possibly it doesn't make sense anymore for you to both be on the employer plan. So maybe your husband's going to keep working, but you're not going to be working. Maybe it doesn't make sense for you to stay on his plan. Medicare might be a better option. Now, the second reason is maybe it's just your household budget, and we'll talk about that and kind of dig into that. Or maybe you have very different healthcare needs. One of you might be on different medications or have different healthcare needs than your spouse. So that could be the second reason. And then stick around to the end of the video because we're going to talk about the 1 reason why it would make sense for you to both be on a similar plan. So first of all, let's look at this situation. Maybe you're both on an employer plan. Maybe one of you is not working, but your spouse is still working. So remember, you do not have to enroll in Medicare just because you're turning 65 years old. So as long as you're with a large employer, and the government considers that 20 or more employees on the payroll. So it doesn't have to be 20 or more employees getting insurance, but just 20 or more employees on the payroll, you can continue to work past 65 and stay on that employer plan. Your spouse can also be on the employer plan. But sometimes you may not have the best employer plan. Some people have kind of lousy plans where they have to pay a lot. They have to pay hundreds of dollars each month to be on that plan. So Medicare might be a better option for your spouse. I know in my family, I get my own insurance because for some reason, for my husband with the family plan, it's not too bad to add the children to his group plan, but it costs a lot more to have me on the plan. So let's say the husband's working, he's 65, your wife is 65. Should she stay on the employer plan with you, or should she go into Medicare? So here's how we want to compare and see which one's going to be the better option. So if we want to consider possibly you staying on the employer plan and your spouse going to Medicare, here's the different options that you would have that we need to compare each of these options to the employer plan and see what would be best. So first we have the least favorable option, which is just original Medicare. So original Medicare is Part A, which is your hospitalization or your inpatient coverage, and Part B, which is your outpatient or your doctor's visits and medical coverage. Now, the problem with just original Medicare is there are 6 gaps. So these are financial gaps that if you don't have another plan to pick up and fill these gaps, you're going to be responsible. And it's a really big financial risk for you. Actually, a lot of people don't know original Medicare pays just 80%. So you would be responsible for 20%, and there's no cap on that. So it is really big financial risk to just be with A and B only. That is not something I would recommend. So most people that we deal with here at Medicare School, they're going one of 2 directions. So they're either going to enroll in A and B, so they're enrolling in original Medicare, and they're either going to do a supplemental plan, which is like a Medigap plan. So you might have heard we have some videos on the G plan, the N plan. These are the most popular right now. And then we add a Part D drug coverage plan to that as well. So this is one option, and we'll break this down and look at that. And then the third option you have are Advantage plans. So Advantage plans are also called Medicare Part C because they somewhat replace original Medicare A and B. So now instead of Medicare and CMS kind of managing your health care, it's a private carrier and company through the Advantage plan that is going to manage your health care. So they replace A and B, and usually the Part D drug coverage is included in these Advantage plans. So that's a route you have to go as well too. So now neither of these are really the right or wrong option. It's just really what option is best for you. All right, so we're going to talk about how you would look at your employer group plan and compare it to one of these options. So when you have original Medicare Parts A and B, and you do have to be signed up and enrolled in A or B for either of these options. So whether you decide to go the supplemental Medigap route or the Advantage Plan route, you do have to be enrolled in Medicare A and B. So let's look first at the cost of that. Let's break down some of these financials. So for Part A, most people have worked at least 40 quarters or 10 years and paid into the Medicare system. So you're paying a portion of that, your employer chips in, and so you're going to get Part A of Medicare for a $0 premium. So for 99% of people, either you're using your own 40 quarters or 10 years, or in this case, maybe you're using your spouse's, right? So you could use a spouse's or even an ex-spouse's if you don't have your own 10 years or 40 quarters. So you're probably going to pay $0 for Part A, but then you're going to pay a minimum in 2025 of $185 a month for Part B. So there is an expense for Medicare Part B. I say a base price of $185 because depending on your income, there is something called an IRMA. We have a lot of videos on IRMAs. We weren't going to go into those today, but it is important to know if you're at a higher income level, then they could charge you more than this $185 for Medicare. Now, this is going to be really important when you're comparing Medicare as an option to your employer plan, because if you're in a very high tax bracket, maybe let's say you make $400,000 a year, you could be paying upwards of anywhere $300, $400, $500, even $600 a month for Medicare. So you definitely need to make sure you do your research on IRMA and you know if you're going to have an IRMA or not and what Part B is going to cost you. But for this scenario, we'll just say average income, and this person is going to pay $185 for Medicare. They're getting Part A at $0, Part B for $185. Now, what does it cost to add on a supplemental plan? Well, there's the G plan and there's the N plan. So the G plan is the most comprehensive plan right now, and one step down from that is the N plan. So it's going to give you a little bit less coverage. You're responsible for a few copays with the N plan. You have this excess charge. It's a 15% excess charge that you could possibly be charged. But either the G plan or the N plan are going to be very comprehensive, good coverage. And these supplemental plans, these vary depending on how old you are, male or female, where you live in the country, so what state you're in. But usually they range anywhere from about, I'd say, $150-ish upwards to $200, depending on where you live in the country. So I'd say the average we see is like maybe $160, $170, could be lower in some states, could be a lot more expensive in other states. But let's say for this purpose, we have just a nice round number of $150 for the supplemental plan. Now we also have to look at the Part D plan. So Part D is for drug. That's your prescription drug coverage, okay? So some people might say, well, hey, I'm not on any medications. Why do I need a Part D drug plan? Well, there's a couple reasons. You never know what's going to happen, right? You may get put on an expensive medication, and you want to make sure you have coverage for that. But also, if you enroll in Medicare, they require you to have a Part D drug plan unless you have credible coverage elsewhere through like the VA or military benefits or something like that, or you'll get a penalty. So you have to get a Part D drug plan. So when we do the supplemental plan, the drug plan is not included. We have to add that on. And these drug plans can range anywhere from $0 to maybe $100, depending on how many medications you're on and what medications you're on, okay? So again, I'm going to go with kind of an average of what we see. I'm going to say $30 for a drug plan, okay? So looking at this, when we add it all up, we have $185 for Part B, and then we have around $150 for the supplemental plan. That's probably if you go with the G plan. And then we have around $30 for the drug plan. So you're looking at about $365 total per month for that person to go on Medicare with a supplemental plan. Now, with an Advantage plan, it works the complete opposite. Most of these Advantage plans are $0 per month. So you actually don't pay a premium for most Advantage plans. Sometimes they could be $20 or $30, but for the most case, they're $0 per month. But the coverage is very different. It's more of a pay-as-you-go system. So you're going to have to pay co-pays. You're going to have to pay deductibles when you go to the doctor. And then you have something called a max out of pocket. So these do work very similarly to an employer plan. You're not paying anything per month for the Advantage plan, but you are paying every time you go to the doctor, every service you need if you're in the hospital. And so let's kind of take a look at how the supplemental plans pay versus how the Advantage plans pay. So let's say you have a G plan. You're going to pay your monthly premium for the G plan. So we said maybe it's $150, okay? It could be $180 in your area. It could be $120 in your area, but it's going to fall somewhere in that range. So you pay your monthly premium and you know what to expect, what it's going to cost. Well, the G plan is very comprehensive and it actually fills 5 out of the 6 gaps when we talk about those Medicare gaps. So it's going to fill 5 out of the 6 gaps. And the only one it doesn't fill is that Part B deductible every year. So every year, the only thing you pay in addition to your premium is you're going to pay that Part B deductible, which this year is $257. So if you have a $200,000 bill, as long as you're seeing doctors who accept Medicare, it's Medicare approved procedures and services, you're going to pay the first $257, and then everything else the rest of the year is going to be covered. Of course, now this is a calendar year deductible, so the next year you'll have another Part B deductible to pay. But these plans are very comprehensive, so you really know what to expect with what you're going to have to pay. Now, let's say you do an N plan. So the N plan, also very similar to the G plan. It's going to be a little bit less because it's kind of a step down with that coverage. So I would say maybe we see these from anywhere from $90 up to like $120. Is probably the price point for the N plan. So you could save a little bit. Some people don't think it's worth it to take the risk on that 15% excess charge, but you could save a little bit money by going with the N plan versus the G plan. Now, what are the differences? So the N plan is going to fill 4 out of the 6 gaps that we have with Medicare. And so you're going to be responsible for that Part B deductible, which is $257. You also have to pay some copays. So when you go to the doctor, you might have anywhere from a $10 to $20 copay. And then you also will have to be responsible for the 15% possible excess charge. Now, what is this excess charge? It's not even legal in some states, so very few doctors do it. I'd say less than 5% of doctors do this. But this is where a doctor cannot just take the allowed Medicare amount, but they can say, hey, we're going to charge over this. We're going to charge 15% or up to 15% in excess charges. So, let's say there's a bill that's $10,000. They're going to add $1,150 to that. You would be responsible for that 15%. So it is a little bit of a bigger risk than the G plan. But there are ways to check, right? If you're going to have a major procedure or a surgery, call the office ahead of time and say, hey, are you a doctor or an office that charges excess charges for Medicare? And just kind of steer clear of those. But this is the difference about how the G plan pays and what you have to pay for an N plan. So now let's look at how an Advantage plan would pay. So with the Advantage plan, again, you're usually probably paying $0 as the premium per month. So you're only paying as you go to the doctor and you need services. So really, there's going to be copays, there's going to be coinsurance, there's going to be deductibles, and there's going to be a max out-of-pocket limit. So it's good to look at the max out-of-pocket because that's the most you would be responsible for in a calendar year that you would have to pay. So some of these max out-of-pockets, if it's an HMO, that's going to be a more limited network because we have to worry about networks with Advantage plans. Those could have a max out-of-pocket as low as $3,000 per year, but then they can go up as high as like $10,000 per year with a PPO. So the HMOs sometimes have a lower max out-of-pocket, where the PPOs are going to have a higher max out-of-pocket. Hey, if you found this video helpful, do us a favor. Go give us a like. We always appreciate it. And subscribe so you don't miss out on any of those future videos. And leave us a comment. We'd love to hear what you have to say. We love to answer any questions you have. That's what it's here for. So drop us a comment below. So to go back again to why it may make sense for your spouse not to stay on an employer plan, maybe it makes sense for you to not even stay on that employer plan if you're turning 65. It might make more sense to go into Medicare. So here's how we can compare the employer plan to your Medicare options. So first of all, we want to look at a few things. What is your monthly premium? So you might want to look at what it costs you and your spouse, or individually each of you, to be on your group employer plan. Just because you have that option doesn't mean it might be the best option. We've talked to people who it costs them $500 or $600 to have their company insurance. They're paying like $250, $300 each pay period, and then they have a bunch of deductibles and copays and max out of pocket on top of that. So look at what is your monthly premium. What do you pay each month for you both to be on the employer plan, or what do you pay to have your spouse on that employer plan with you? Sometimes you'll be surprised. As the employee yourself, you may not pay that much each paycheck to have that insurance, but you may pay a lot more for having your spouse on that plan, okay? So these are just some things you want to compare. Now remember, keep in mind with Medicare, you do have to enroll in A and B, so you're going to have a monthly premium for Part B of at least $185. So that's what we're comparing. What is your premium to have your work plan compared to what it would cost you just for the premium to even have Medicare? Okay, now next we'd have to think about the copays and the coinsurance, right? So look at your employer plan. Is it an HMO? Is it a PPO? How restrictive is it? How much do you have to pay for copays and coinsurance? Remember that if you go to the doctor a lot, these can add up. And if you're on a supplemental or a G plan, you don't have to pay anything but that first $257. So remember, you don't have to pay a copay every time you go to the doctor. They're a little bit more comprehensive. So that's something else we want to look at. Next, we want to look at the deductible. So I know for my employer plan, I think I have like a $1,500 deductible. And what that means is the employer's not going to pay anything until you've reached that amount. You have to pay out of pocket yourself until you've reached that amount, and then they will start covering and paying for things. So what is your deductible with your employer plan, and how does that look when you're comparing it to going into Medicare? So let's look at that max out of pocket if you have a Medigap plan, like a supplemental G plan. So we looked at the breakdown. It's going to cost you about $185 a month to have Part B of Medicare. So unless you have an IRMA, you're paying about $185 plus around $150-ish for that G plan. And then you're looking at about $30 per month for a drug plan. So if you remember, when we added that up, it came to about $365 a month that you're paying to have original Medicare plus a supplemental and a drug plan. Now, if we multiply that by 12, that's going to come out to around $4,380 a year. Now, you might think that looks like a big price tag and have a little bit of sticker shock there. But remember, this is very comprehensive coverage. You're not paying copays when you go to the doctor. The only thing you're paying is the $257 on top of this each year. So for around $4,500, $4,600, you're completely covered with your medical bills as high as they may be for the year. Okay, so now if we do an Advantage plan, we're going to have copays, we're going to have deductibles, we're going to pay as we go for things. If you need an MRI, you're going to have to pay for that. If you have a stay in the hospital, you're going to have to pay for that. If you have x-rays, you're going to have to pay for that, right? But we look at it's $0 a month to have that Advantage plan, probably. But what's the max out of pocket you could spend in a year? Well, usually I see the max out of pockets are between $6,000 and $8,000 on most of the PPOs. So let's just be conservative and say $6,000 is your max out of pocket. Like I said, I see this as high as $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 for plans. But let's just say your max out of pocket is $6,000. You're pretty much looking at about $6,000 a year to have that Advantage plan if you maxed out the plan, okay? So that still comes in higher than the supplemental plan with a drug plan included. Now, how do we look at this in your employer plan? So we would want to look at your employer plan. So let's say that your employer plan, it costs you to have your spouse on the plan about $300 a month, okay? That's $3,600 a year, okay? Just to have your spouse on the plan. Now you have to pay copays, you have to pay deductibles, you have to pay coinsurance. Maybe you have a $5,000 max out of pocket on this plan. So if you maxed out that plan, you had to use your insurance a lot that year, you could be looking at as high as $8,600 for your employer plan. So this is the employer plan, this is looking at the Advantage plan, and this is looking at like the G or the N, the supplemental plans. So even though it may not seem like it because you're paying more per month with that Medicare and that supplemental plan, it ends out, if you max out your plan, being less in a calendar year than it would have if you went the Advantage route or if you would have stayed on your employer plan. So hopefully this makes sense. And if you give us a call, this is what we do. We can talk to you about your current plan that you have through your employer. Kind of break down, what are you paying for that? What does the coverage look like? Are you happy with that plan? Maybe your plan doesn't cost a ton, but you have a really limited network of doctors you can go to. You'll have more freedom with Medicare, going into Medicare. So there's a lot of different variables you can look at, but it doesn't always make sense to stay with your employer plan if you're going to continue working past 65. And even if you stay on the plan, it might make sense to split the family decision. You stay on the employer plan and possibly your spouse goes into Medicare. The second plan, it might not make sense for you and your spouse to be on the same Medicare plan, is that maybe your budget or you just both have very different healthcare needs. So again, there's no crystal ball with health. Like just because you're in great health now or you don't take many medications now, you should really think worst case scenario, right? Because you never know what can happen. But maybe the budget is tight. So we talked about with those supplemental plans, they are the most comprehensive coverage, but they can be pricey, right? So let's say that it's $150 for each person in your household. You know, the two of you, it's going to cost $300 a month just to have those supplemental plans. Then we have to add the $185 for each of you on top of that. So it can be pricier if you have two people to get the supplemental plans. But again, excellent, very comprehensive coverage if you have them in the budget. So sometimes we see where one person will get a G plan, but maybe the husband will say, hey, I don't go to the doctor as much. I'm in good health. I'm just going to go with the N plan. So there's a chance you can both decide to do supplemental plans, but one person goes with the G and one person goes with an N. We also have split decisions in families where one person is like, hey, I go to a lot of specialists. I see a lot of doctors. I'm going to go with a Medigap plan. I want to do a G or an N. And the other person's like, hey, I want the perks of the dental, the vision, the hearing. I don't go to the doctor very often. So I'm going to do a $0 Advantage plan. Okay. So that one person's paying for that Medigap supplemental plan. The other person decides to go with an Advantage plan. This happens a lot, right? There's no reason you have to both be on the same kind of plan. Now, there is something to keep in mind, and that's that whenever you come into Medicare, whether that's when you're turning 65 or when you're coming in through an SEP when you retire, you have a 6-month window where you're guaranteed to be granted and issued one of those Medigap plans, a supplemental plan. So this is called your OEP. This is your open enrollment period for your Medigap plan, where they cannot turn you down. So even if you've had cancer 2 weeks ago, a heart attack a week ago, they don't ask any medical underwriting questions, and you're guaranteed to get that supplemental plan. So just keep in mind, even though you think you don't have any health issues now, it may be appealing to go with that $0 Advantage plan. This may be your one window of opportunity when you're coming into Medicare to have that 6-month OEP and get that supplemental plan with no medical underwriting. Okay. So again, the budget, right? Maybe you'd both like to have supplemental plans, but it's just not in the budget. So one of you goes with either the N or you go with an Advantage plan. But remember one thing when you're looking at going to Medicare compared to those employer plans, there is a cap with those Part D plans. Where you won't spend more than $2,000 in a calendar year on medications. So maybe one of you is on a very expensive medication. This is going to be a huge benefit. And some people say, well, hey, what if my drug's not on the formulary? What if Medicare doesn't cover my drug? Well, that's what we do here at Medicare School. Call us. We talk with you and we'll ask you, who are your doctors you go to? What medications are you on? We want to make sure we find you a Part D plan where your medication is covered. Sometimes if that medication's not covered, you can get what's called a formulary exception, where your doctor writes a letter to the insurance carrier, says, hey, we have this medication, this patient needs it, it's not on formulary. Can you make an exception and put this medication on the formulary? And more than often, they're going to approve that and they're happy to do it. So this is a good perk too, knowing that Your employer plan, you're not going to have a cap on medications that you'll spend in a year, but you will have that with the Medicare Part D. That's for both the Advantage plans or the supplemental plans. Either route you go, $2,000 cap on medications in 2025. All right, so we talked about the 2 reasons why it may not be advantageous to be on the same Medicare plan, right? Possibly look at comparing that employer plan to Medicare if you're going to continue to keep working, and definitely take in mind your budget. I mean, you have to be able to afford the plans that you choose and your individual healthcare needs. Now, let's finally look at the one reason you might want to be, or you should be, on the same plans or with the same carrier, and that is a carrier discount. So if you both want to have supplemental plans, doesn't matter if you have a G plan or an N plan, if you're with the same carrier, they offer you a discount. So you could get a monthly discount just like you would do with State Farm. If everybody has their policy under, their cars are all under State Farm. Sometimes you get a family discount. Same with these Medigap plans. You can get a discount if you and your spouse are both with the same carrier. So I've seen anywhere up to possibly like $20 a month. So some of the companies have like a 7% discount, 10% discount. Really depends on the carrier you go with. But this could save you, $40 or $50 a month. That could add up over the course of the year. So if you're both going to get supplemental plans anyways, whether those are the same, the G or in the N, it may be beneficial if you go with the same carrier and you get that household discount. So if you want to learn more about the difference between supplemental and Advantage plans, just watch this video to get all the information that you need.